Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click, but for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance. The employee helps the millionaire fix his car until she notices the ring on his finger. The engine coughed twice and died. Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel had been stranded on the side of Federal Highway 57 for 40 minutes, the sun beating down on his neck, his phone with no signal. It was Tuesday. He had a meeting at 3 p.m. with the directors of Transportes Aguirre, a company valued at 2.3 billion pesos, with 400 trucks on the road and a presence in 18 states. And the entire universe had decided that was the perfect day for his latest model Audi to turn into luxury scrap metal. He called his assistant 3 times. Nothing. He hit the steering wheel with his palm. Once, twice. He got out of the car, his tie still on, as if elegance could negotiate with an engine, and lifted the hood without knowing exactly why. What he saw inside could have spoken to him in Mandarin. He wouldn't have understood anyway. That's when he heard the sound of an old truck braking behind him. He paid it no mind. He continued to stare at the engine with the look of a man about to call someone who actually knew something. "I'll help you." The voice was young, female, and devoid of any doubt. Fulgencio turned slowly, with that expression men have when they're not accustomed to anyone offering them anything without wanting something in return. She got out of the truck with the same naturalness with which one might step out to buy bread. A navy blue uniform with a white apron, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, a few wisps escaping at her temples, unpainted nails, work shoes, and a gaze that didn't ask permission. Consuelo Vargas Reyes, 24 years old, a domestic worker since she was 16, daughter of the best mechanic who ever set foot in the workshop in Colonia Guerrero in Mexico City. "No thank you," Fulgencio said, and went back to staring at the engine as if ignoring it would make a real mechanic appear. She didn't move. "The oxygen sensor is loose, and the air filter is clogged. The radiator is also leaking, but that's older. It won't start like this." Fulgencio looked at her directly for the first time. "Excuse me, it won't start," she repeated without raising her voice. "Will you let me take a look, or do you prefer to wait for someone in 2 hours?" There was a silence. The kind of silence that takes the shape of a man deciding if his pride is worth more than arriving on time. "All right," he finally said, stepping aside. Consuelo rolled up her uniform sleeves to her elbows, took a worn canvas bag from her truck, and got to work. There was no gesture of showing off. "No, look how I do it. Just hands that knew where to go." The sound of metal, the quiet concentration of someone who has done this hundreds of times since childhood. Standing next to her father in a windowless workshop, learning the names of the parts before she could even read a clock properly. Fulgencio crossed his arms, watched her, and said nothing. 3 minutes later, she turned the key he handed her. The engine started cleanly, without a cough, without hesitation. Consuelo closed the hood carefully, not slamming it shut like those who don't respect cars, and wiped her hands with a folded rag she kept in her apron pocket. "Done? The radiator needs to be looked at soon, but you'll get where you're going today." Fulgencio opened his mouth to say something. Anything. Thank you, perhaps. Or a question about how she knew all that. But that's when he saw the ring. A simple, thin silver band on the ring finger of her right hand. It wasn't an engagement or wedding ring. It was a mechanic's ring. The kind you get when you learn the trade and your father tells you you're ready. A workshop tradition. Fulgencio didn't know that, couldn't have known it, but something about that detail made him pause for a second longer than usual. "Where did you learn?" he finally asked. "With my dad." "And what do you do?" She looked at him without changing her expression. "What you see. I'm a domestic worker." Fulgencio nodded slowly. There was something in her tone, without bitterness, without wounded pride. Just the truth spoken, as one might mention the weather, that unsettled him in a way he couldn't identify. "I need an employee," he said. The phrase came out harsher than he intended. "Mine quit last week. If you want the job, I'll give it to you." Consuelo studied him for a moment. "How much does it pay?" He named a figure, double what she earned where she was. She thought for 3 seconds, no more. Well, there was no exaggerated emotion, no effusive joy or clasped hands, just a transaction between 2 people on the side of a highway, with the engine still warm between them. Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel was the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Not through charisma, that's for those who need to be loved. He filled spaces for another reason, from an absolute, unshakable, almost physical certainty that the world was organized correctly and he was in his rightful place. 37 years old, heir to Transportes Aguirre, educated at Tec de Monterrey and with postgraduate studies in Madrid that he never finished because he was called to take over the family business when his father fell ill. Dark hair, a neat haircut, clothes that cost what Consuelo earned in 2 months, and an extraordinary capacity for not seeing people who weren't useful to him. He wasn't cruel by nature. He was indifferent by habit. The estate where he lived, Hacienda El Benedito, on the outskirts of Querétaro, built in 1887, restored 3 times, valued at 48 million pesos. It had 7 bedrooms, 2 gardens, a kitchen he didn't use, and an entire wing that hadn't been opened for months because no one had bothered to do so. Also living there, in the smallest room of the north wing, was Don Tranquilino, Fulgencio's uncle, 73 years old, co-founder of Transportes Aguirre. No one spoke of that. And now a silent presence, who had his coffee in the patio at 6 a.m. and read novels from the last century with a magnifying glass he kept in his vest pocket. No one asked for his opinion, and he didn't offer it. Consuelo arrived at the hacienda on a Thursday afternoon with a medium-sized suitcase and the same expression as always. Attentive, calm, neither surprised nor reverent. Abundio, the gatekeeper, saw her arrive from his booth and mumbled something that was neither a question nor a comment, but sounded vaguely like, "Another one that lasts 3 weeks." Consuelo didn't hear him, or heard him, and didn't care. It was hard to tell with her. The first week was quiet. Consuelo learned the house without asking too many questions. She understood the schedules, the preferences, the areas she shouldn't enter. She learned that Fulgencio ate breakfast alone, that he didn't want conversation before 9 a.m., that he took his coffee with no sugar and little milk, and that if something was wrong in the house, he'd say it with a short phrase and expect the problem to disappear. She made problems disappear, but she also noticed other things. She noticed that the plumbing in the West Wing had been faulty for months, and no one had called a technician. That the well pump lost pressure on Wednesday afternoons. That the laundry room lock sounded like it was about to give way at any moment. One Sunday morning, without telling anyone, she dismantled the lock, lubricated it, adjusted the mechanism, and reassembled it. When Fulgencio arrived that afternoon and opened the door without the usual squeak, he paused for a second. He said nothing, but he paused. Edubiges Salazar arrived the following Friday with 2 carry-on bags, large sunglasses, and that way of entering a house, as if it were already hers. She was the girlfriend, 32 years old, from a family with old money from Guadalajara, the face of a woman who had practiced her smile enough times for it to look natural. She saw Consuelo in the hallway and looked her up and down with a gaze that needed no words because it had already said everything. "Are you the new one?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Keep walking. No noise after 10, and tomorrow's coffee with no milk." Consuelo nodded. Edubiges no longer looked at her. For her, Consuelo had ceased to exist the moment she received the answer she needed. That night, Consuelo was washing dishes in the kitchen when she heard the conversation from the hallway. She didn't mean to listen. The stone walls of the hacienda simply didn't keep secrets. "You hired her from the side of the road?" Edubiges' voice was one of those that knew how to be both soft and cutting. "Fulgencio, that's ridiculous. You don't even know who she is. She fixed the car. Any mechanic would have fixed the car. You didn't need to bring her to live here. She does her job well. I don't care what she does. I care about how it looks, and what it could imply." A pause. Silence. Edubiges is the employee. Exactly. And she must remain so. Consuelo wrung out the sponge. She folded it carefully over the edge of the sink. She didn't feel anger. She felt something older than anger. A recognition. That sensation of knowing exactly the space assigned to you in the world, and the quiet, firm decision not to be that. She turned off the kitchen light and went to sleep. Tomorrow was another day, and she knew, with the same certainty she knew the name of every engine part, that something in that house was about to change. What would you do if you knew the person who underestimates you the most was exactly the person who would need you the most? But before I tell you what happened next, if this story already has your heart in a knot, imagine what's coming. Give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss any chapters. There are things that aren't said, they're carried. They're carried in the way you fold sheets more slowly when you're thinking about something painful, in how you drink your coffee even when it no longer has flavor, In the way you say good morning, with the exact same voice as always, without an extra millimeter. Because if you give sadness even a little more space, it takes over everything. Consuelo Vargas Reyes had been carrying that since she was 17. Her father, Gregorio Vargas, a mechanic by trade, a man of few words and hands that knew how to listen to an engine as others listened to music. He had died on a Tuesday in November, without warning. Cardiac arrest. Alone in his workshop, with the radio on, and a tsuru lifted on the jack. She found him when she went to bring him lunch. He was 44, she was 17. From that day on, Consuelo worked without pause, without complaint, without the luxury of asking herself if it was fair. First at a tortilla factory, then cleaning offices at night, then as a domestic worker, which paid better and at least provided her with room and board. She wasn't bitter. That's what confused people. They expected bitterness and found something different, a calmness that came from within, not from resignation, but from knowing that the world owes you nothing and still deciding to do things right. The ring on her finger belonged to her father. He wore it until the day he placed it on her hand and told her, in his way of speaking, which was more like not speaking, "You know what you know, don't waste it." That was all. That was enough. The second week at the hacienda, Consuelo began to note Don Tranquilino's schedule. The old man had an almost liturgical routine. Coffee at 6, newspaper at 7, even though it was 3 days old, because no one renewed it. And then a slow walk around the inner courtyard that lasted exactly the time it took him to complete 3 full laps of the garden. Then he would sit on the same stone bench, take out his book, and read until the sun became uncomfortable. No one spoke to him. He didn't seem to expect them to. One Wednesday, Consuelo went out to the patio to shake out the rugs and saw that the old man's cup had been empty for a while. She went inside, made him another coffee, just like the first one, which she had memorized, filtered, black, hot, but not boiling, and brought it to him without a word. Don Tranquilino looked up from his book. He looked at her, not with surprise, but with something slower than that. "Thank you," he said. "With pleasure." He was about to speak again when she turned to leave. "What's your name?" "Consuelo." The old man nodded slowly, as if the name confirmed something he already suspected. "What an honest name," he said, and returned to his book. Consuelo didn't know what to do with that. She let it be. Fulgencio treated Consuelo as one treats good furniture, with a certain instrumental care, without affection, with the expectation that it will remain there and function. He spoke to her in short commands. It wasn't rudeness, it was something worse. It was absence. He looked at her without seeing her. He passed by her in the hallways as if the air simply rearranged itself. Consuelo watched him without him noticing. She noticed he came home late almost every night, that he ate dinner alone even when Edubiges was in the house, which happened 2 or 3 times a week, always with suitcases, as if on a visit, even if she stayed for several days. She noticed he never listened to music, that he had no personal photos in any visible room, that the only object that seemed to hold sentimental value was a wall clock in his office that never worked, but that he also never threw away. He was a man full of unfinished things. Consuelo recognized that, not with pity. With that clinical eye that develops when one grows up watching their father diagnose engines by their sound. Something inside was broken, and he didn't even know where to look. On Thursday of the second week, Eduviges found a pretext. Fulgencio was on a long call in his office when Eduviges entered the kitchen with her characteristic way of entering places, more like an inspection than an arrival. Consuelo was preparing dinner. "The chicken is raw inside," Eduviges said, pointing to the tray that had just come out of the oven. Consuelo approached and checked it. "It's perfectly done, ma'am. It needs 15 more minutes to rest." "I told you it was raw." "With all due respect, ma'am, it's not raw. If you cut it now, it will lose its juices and dry out." Eduviges looked at her with a calmness that was something else disguised as calm. "How interesting," the employee said. "You're explaining to me how my kitchen works." "It's not your kitchen, ma'am." Silence. It was barely a fraction of a second. Consuelo had said it without raising her voice, without intending to hurt, simply as a fact. "This kitchen isn't yours, is it?" Unadorned. But they both knew something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. Eduviges smiled in that way that has no warmth. "Talk to Fulgencio. Tell him you think the food is fine." And she left. Consuelo finished preparing dinner. She served everything with the same precision as always. When Fulgencio came out of his office and sat at the table, he took the first bite and said nothing. Then he took another. On the third bite, something in his face changed. Barely. Not a smile, not a gesture. Just the minimal relaxation of a man eating something that truly tastes good. He didn't say it. Of course not. But Consuelo saw it from the kitchen and knew. That night, Edues called someone. Consuelo didn't hear the whole conversation, only a fragment through the wall as she cleared the patio table. It's not the job that worries me. It's that Fulgencio is looking at her differently. A pause. No, he doesn't know it yet, but we need to make a move before he notices. Consuelo, picking up the last glasses, took them to the kitchen, washed them one by one with hot water, and felt no fear. She felt something more akin to the concentration one feels when hearing a strange noise in the engine. It's not panic, it's attention. It's the moment you know something is about to break, and you have to decide whether to let it fall or hold it. On Friday, Tranquilino didn't go out to the patio. Consuelo waited until 8. She made coffee anyway and went to knock softly on his door. "Don Tranquilino, come in," came the voice, more muffled than usual. The room was small and tidy, with the precision of people who have learned to fit into small spaces. A twin bed, a desk piled high with books, arranged with care, a window overlooking the interior patio. On the desk, among the books, a framed photograph. A young man in mechanic's overalls, standing next to a dump truck, smiling. Consuelo saw it for a second before looking away. Don Tranquilino was sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand resting on his chest. It wasn't a complaint. It was the posture of someone who knows that weight well and has learned to bear it without fuss. "Can I bring you something?" Consuelo asked. "The coffee is fine." She left it on the small table. She was about to leave when the old man spoke. "The one in the photo," he said, without pointing, "was the one who built this company, not with money, but with his hands." He paused. No one remembers that anymore. Consuelo didn't ask who he was talking about. Something in the old man's tone told her it wasn't necessary. "Things built with hands aren't forgotten," she said. "They're just covered up." Don Tranquilino looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her so directly, completely, like when you see something you didn't expect to find. "Where are you from?" he asked. "From the DF, Colonia Guerrero. Your father, a mechanic." The old man nodded very slowly. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Sit down," Consuelo said. He hesitated for a second, then pulled a chair from the desk and sat down. Outside, the garden was still. The sun entered obliquely through the window, dividing the room in half. Light and shadow, exactly in the middle. Don Tranquilino said nothing more for a long while, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that has its own weight and temperature. The kind of silence shared by people who know time is not abundant, and neither are words. Consuelo waited. Downstairs in the dining room, Fulgencio was having breakfast alone, his phone in hand, replying to emails without looking up, unaware that in the north wing something small but irreversible had begun. Like all true changes, without warning, without noise. Just two people in a room with light split in half, and between them something that didn't yet have a name, but already existed. Do you know what the worst part is? That Fulgencio was so busy looking at his numbers that he didn't see what was in front of him? And what was in front of him was exactly what he would need most. But wait, because you won't believe what comes next. No one expected her to speak. That was what confused them the most, that Consuelo didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't do what someone is supposed to do when humiliated in front of everyone. That she simply stood there with a calm that wasn't hers by design. It was something else, something harder to name and much harder to ignore. It was a Thursday, a board meeting in the main hall of the hacienda. Fulgencio had converted the large dining room into a workroom for that meeting. 8 men around the long oak table, laptops open, projector at the back, freshly brewed coffee, the route managers, the general accountant, the corporate lawyer, and 2 minority partners who had traveled from Monterrey specifically for that session. The problem was simple in its statement and catastrophic in its consequences. The northeast route of Transportes Aguirre, 42 trucks, 3 states, the most profitable contract for the company for 6 years, was collapsing. 3 weeks of accumulated delays, 2 federal fines, a major client threatening to cancel a contract worth 180 million pesos annually. The engineers had spent 22 days without finding the cause. They spoke of tracking software, shift failures, union problems. Nothing added up. Consuelo entered to serve the second round of coffee at 11 in the morning. She walked along the wall, invisible as always, filling cups without making noise. And as she did, she listened. She didn't want to listen, but the data came to her on its own, as it always had since she was a child when her father explained an engine problem out loud to think better. The route left Monterrey at 4 in the morning, arriving systematically late in San Luis. The problem was concentrated in the Matehuala stretch. The trucks lost time at the scales, but the scales reported no irregularities. Fulgencio said something that silenced everyone. If no one in this room has a solution, I'm going to have to assume the problem is the room. Tense silence. The accountant cleared his throat. The lawyer opened his mouth, and Consuelo, without fully thinking, without exactly deciding, said, "The problem isn't in Matehuala, it's before." 8 heads turned at the same time. Fulgencio looked at her, not with anger, but with something colder, with the expression of someone who doesn't understand what just happened. "Excuse me," he said, and in that single word was an entire coordinate system. You here, me there, and between us, a distance that cannot be crossed. Consuelo placed the coffee pot on the side table. She didn't move from where she stood, but she didn't lower her gaze either. If the delay is systematic and always in the same stretch, and the scales show nothing, the problem is at the departure, not on the road. The trucks are leaving overloaded from origin. It's not a route failure, it's a loading failure. No one spoke. One of the directors, Heriberto, the logistics manager, who had been with the company for 18 years, slowly opened his laptop, typed something, and waited. "The cargo manifests from the last 3 weeks," he said, without looking up from the screen. More silence. "There's an average discrepancy of 280 kilograms per unit." Another systematic pause from the origin warehouse. Someone at the table muttered a curse word. Fulgencio didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the projector, then the window, then the table. When he finally looked at her, his face said nothing that could be easily read. It was the face of a man recalibrating something internally, with great care so as not to show it. "How do you know that?" he finally asked. "My father had trucks. It wasn't a complete truth or a complete lie. Gregorio Vargas never owned a fleet, but he did repair cargo trucks for 20 years, and Consuelo had heard enough stories about overloads, fines, and downtime to recognize the pattern when she heard it." Fulgencio nodded once. Just once. "You can leave," he told her. Consuelo picked up the coffee pot and left. In the hallway, Don Abundio, the doorman, waited for her without knowing he was waiting, arms crossed by the service door. And when he saw her emerge from the director's room with the coffee pot in hand and the same face as always, he said, louder than he intended, "Ay, caray, what was that?" What happened next? Consuelo didn't know immediately. She knew the meeting extended for 2 more hours. She knew they called the origin warehouse in Monterrey. She knew because Heriberto went out for water and asked her for it, with an expression that was a mixture of astonishment and professional shame, that they had found the person responsible for the systematic overloading, a shift supervisor who had been signing altered manifests for months in exchange for a percentage under the table. 180 million pesos saved. 3 weeks of problem solved in 12 minutes. No one told her directly. No one came to her room that night to say thank you, or well done, or how did you know. That didn't happen. What happened was this. The next day, when Consuelo served the morning coffee, Fulgencio looked up from his phone, something he never did before 9 o'clock, and said, with his usual economy, "The coffee is fine." Consuelo nodded. She went to wash the dishes, and in that tiny, almost stingy phrase, so short for what he could have said, Consuelo heard what he didn't say, that something had changed, that he knew it, that he still didn't know what to do with it. That was enough for now. Edibages, on the other hand, knew immediately. Heriberto was the brother-in-law of one of her cousins. That's how those networks worked, invisible and efficient like wiring behind a wall. And by Thursday night, Edibages had the full version. She found Fulgencio in his office. "I heard about the meeting," she said, sitting down opposite him with her usual calm, which Consuelo had recently learned to read as an alarm signal. "We solved the problem. The employee solved the problem. Someone in the room solved it. The result is the same." Edibages crossed her legs. She adjusted a lock of hair with a gesture that seemed casual and wasn't. "Fulgencio, listen to me carefully." A calculated pause. "That woman isn't what she seems. Nobody is what they seem. You're not understanding me." Another pause. It's not normal for a domestic employee to know about cargo logistics. It's not normal for her to speak in a board meeting as if she had a right. It's not normal that in 2 weeks she already knows more about this estate than people who have been here for years. Fulgencio looked at her. What are you saying? Find out who she really is. She stood up. Before it's too late for it to matter. She left without waiting for a response. Fulgencio remained with his gaze fixed on the closed door. He drummed his fingers on the desk once, twice, then he opened his laptop and searched. Gregorio Vargas, mechanic. Colonia Guerrero, Mexico City. The results told him nothing special. A small workshop, no legal history, no connection to any registered transport company. He closed the laptop. He told himself that Edubijas was exaggerating, but the search engine remained open in his head all night. On Saturday morning, Consuelo was in the patio, hanging clothes, when Don Tranquilino came out with his coffee and his book and sat on his usual bench. He watched her for a moment. I've already been told about the meeting, he said without preamble. Consuelo continued hanging clothes. Who told you? He pressed. That man can't keep anything quiet. The old man took a sip. Well done. I only said what I saw. That's the hardest part. Don Tranquilino opened the book, but didn't read. Most people prefer not to see, so they don't have to say anything. Consuelo finished with the last sheet. She wiped her hands on her apron. Did you know the trucks? She asked. A long pause. I saw them born, said the old man. The first one was a beat-up truck that my brother and I bought with what we had saved over 10 years. He paused. My brother was the one with the contacts. I was the one who knew how everything worked inside. And what happened? Don Tranquilino closed the book without having truly opened it, because sometimes the one who knows how something works inside isn't the one who ends up in the papers. He said no more. It wasn't necessary. Consuelo looked at the old man for a moment, then looked at the estate, the stone walls, the arches of the corridor, the garden with its fountain that hadn't worked for years, 48 million pesos of history, with something buried in the center that no one had wanted to unearth. Something stirred in her chest. It wasn't ambition. It was something closer to quiet indignation, the kind felt by someone who sees an old injustice and understands for the first time that it has a name. That afternoon, while Fulgencio was reviewing reports in his office, Consuelo walked down the hallway and stopped for a second in front of the door. She didn't go in, she didn't speak, she just listened for a moment to the silence of a man, very alone in a very large room, surrounded by numbers that told him nothing of what he truly needed to know. She kept walking, but something in her had already decided. She didn't know exactly what yet. She only knew that this egocentric, cold man, convinced that the world was in order, this man was going to need her, and that she, even though she didn't love him yet, was starting to see him. Wait, because in the next part, a night without light will shatter all protocol, and what happens in that darkness will be irreversible for both of them. The power went out at 9:43 on a Wednesday. It wasn't a dramatic blackout, it was the silent type, a soft click, a flicker, and then nothing. The entire estate plunged into darkness with that particular silence that large houses have when they lose electricity, as if the darkness were darker here than anywhere else. Edubijas wasn't there. She had returned to Guadalajara that same day with her 2 carry-on bags and the promise to return on the weekend. Don Tranquilino had been asleep since 8 Sabandio, in his booth by the gate, turned on his battery-powered radio, and settled in to wait, like someone who had seen this many times. Fulgencio was in the garage, not because he knew what to do there, but because it was the only place on the estate where it still made some sense to look. The electrical panel was on the far wall, behind the 2 cars and Consuelo's old truck. And he was staring at it with his phone's flashlight, just as he had stared at the engine on the road, with the certainty that if you look long enough, the problem will eventually resolve itself. It doesn't resolve itself. Consuelo entered the garage with a flashlight, a real one, with rechargeable batteries, which she herself had bought the first week, because in large houses, blackouts are a matter of when, not if. She saw him from behind, standing in front of the panel. She saw his posture, tense shoulders, rigid neck, the phone held high as an offering to a god who wouldn't answer. The circuit breaker tripped, she said directly, probably because of the well pump. I told you 2 weeks ago that it needed to be checked. Fulgencio lowered the phone and turned. In the flashlight's beam, his face was different. There was no office, no suit, no complete architecture of being Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel. He was just a man in a garage who didn't know how to turn off the darkness. Can you fix it? He asked. without his usual tone, without his usual distance, just the question. Yes, Consuelo said, but I need you to hold the flashlight. What happened in the next 40 minutes wasn't dramatic. There was no music, no lingering glances, no the kind of conversation you see in movies when two people are alone in the dark. It was this. Consuelo worked. Fulgencio held the flashlight, and as she examined the panel, adjusted the breaker, inspected the wiring coming from the well pump, he watched her not with his usual gaze, that gaze of inventory, of categorization, but with something different, with real attention. He saw her handle the tools without hesitation. He saw how her hands found the exact spots without fumbling, like someone who knows the territory by heart. He saw that she didn't make any extra movements, that she didn't waste a single gesture, that everything she touched had a clear and direct purpose. How do you know where everything is? He asked. It wasn't criticism, it was genuine curiosity. My dad used to say that an electrical system and a transport system are the same, she said without stopping her work. Current that goes from one place to another. If there's resistance at any point, everything slows down. You have to find where the resistance is. Fulgencio said nothing, but he repeated that in his head. Current that goes from one place to another. If there's resistance at any point, everything slows down. What happened to your dad? He asked, and then he didn't quite know why he had asked. Consuelo's hands stopped for a second. Just a second. He died when I was 17. I'm sorry, it's been a long time. Time doesn't change certain things. Consuelo looked at him. It was quick, just an instant. But she looked him in the eye, and he didn't look away. No, she said. It doesn't. There was a silence that wasn't awkward. It was the kind that fills the space because it has its own substance. Then Consuelo finished what she was doing. She flipped the breaker, and the estate's lights came back on with a jolt. All the rooms at the same time. The garden, the corridors, the fountain that still didn't work. But now at least it was illuminated. Fulgencio blinked at the light. Pentina. Soelo packed the tools in her canvas bag with her usual calm. Tomorrow I'll call the pump technician, she said. If it's not repaired, it'll happen again. Fine. She was about to leave when he spoke. Consuelo. She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. What did your dad study? A pause. Nothing. She turned just enough for him to hear her clearly. He learned on his own. He liked to understand how things work. Fulgencio nodded very slowly. You too, he said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. Consuelo didn't answer. She just left the garage with her flashlight, leaving Fulgencio alone with the recovered light and something inside him that still didn't have a name, but which would no longer fit in the drawer where he kept the things he didn't want to see. The next day, Fulgencio did something he hadn't done in weeks. He ate breakfast without his phone in his hand. Consuelo noticed when she brought him his coffee. The table without devices, his eyes looking at the garden, his shoulders slightly more relaxed than usual. She said nothing. She served the coffee. She was about to leave. Sit down, he said. Consuelo looked at him. Please. What do you want me to sit on? He gestured to the chair opposite him. A moment. It was one of those orders that sounded like an order, but were something else. Consuelo pulled the chair out and sat down with her back straight, her hands on the table, her usual expression. Fulgencio studied her. Why did you accept this job, he asked. It paid well, that's all. What else do you want me to say? Fulgencio drummed the edge of the cup. Most people who work here tell me what I want to hear. From the first day. I don't know what you want to hear. Exactly. A pause. Why? Consuelo thought for a moment before answering. Because if I say what you want to hear, the problem you have remains a problem. It's just that you no longer see it. She looked at him. And problems that aren't seen are the ones that end up breaking everything. Fulgencio looked at her for a long time. What do you think my problem is? He finally asked. It's not my place to say, I'm asking you. Another longer silence, confusing the price of things with the value of things, Consuelo said. And she said it without cruelty, as if it were a technical diagnosis. And that makes you make bad decisions about what to keep and what to let go. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Fulgencio didn't get angry, he didn't get defensive. He looked at his coffee. He swirled it once in the cup. That's it, he said in a very low voice, as if talking to himself. The most honest thing anyone has told me in a long time. Consuelo got up. I'll bring you more coffee. Fulgencio almost smiled. Almost. Yes. Edubiges returned on Friday with her suitcases and her sunglasses, and that ability she had to read rooms before entering them. She read this Fulgencio in the dining room having breakfast without a phone, Consuelo serving coffee with her usual calm, and between the two of them, a silence that wasn't the silence of before, of absence, of indifference. It was an inhabited silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who already know each other, even if they don't know it yet. Audi just knew it in 2 seconds. She kissed Fulgencio on the cheek. She smiled at Consuelo with her usual smile. And as soon as Consuelo left the room, Audi just sat down opposite Fulgencio and said without preamble, with that softness that was her sharpest weapon, "How long has it been since you called me?" Fulgencio frowned. "I called you on Tuesday. Tuesday was 5 days ago." Fulgencio. Pause. "I've been very busy with her. With the company." He looked at her. "Edues. Don't start." "I'm not starting anything." She adjusted the napkin on her lap with a precision that was the opposite of calm. "I'm just observing." And what she observed, though she didn't say it out loud yet, was that Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel, the most difficult man in the world to move, the man who made decisions with a calculator and not with his heart, was starting to see someone, and that someone was not her. Don Abundio, who passed by the corridor at that precise moment, pushing his cleaning cart, heard the end of the silence between the two, and murmured to himself, without realizing that Fulgencio heard him perfectly, "Oh, this is going to get interesting. I said it from day one. I said it." Fulgencio looked at him. Abundio quickened his pace without looking back. That night, Consuelo was in her room, with the window open, when she heard footsteps in the outside corridor. Slow, she recognized Don Tranquilino, who sometimes walked at night when he couldn't sleep. She peeked out. The old man stood in the hallway, gazing at the dark garden with one hand resting on the stone pillar. In the other, something she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. A folded, old piece of paper, the kind that's been opened and closed so many times the creases were part of the paper itself. "Can't sleep?" Consuelo asked softly. Don Tranquilino didn't startle, as if he'd known she'd be there. "Sometimes memory won't let you," he said. He carefully tucked the paper into his vest pocket, with the kind of care one gives to something fragile and essential. Consuelo watched him a moment longer. "Good night, Don Tranquilino." "Good night, Consuelo." A pause. "Take care." It wasn't a nighttime farewell. It was something else. It was a warning. It was how old men who've seen much tell someone young, "I know you're in the heart of something now, and I want you to come through it well." Consuelo closed the window slowly. She went to bed. She thought of the engine of the Federal Highway 57, how it had purred clean once she found where the resistance lay. She thought people functioned the same way, and that finding the resistance in Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel was going to be the hardest and most important job she'd ever done. She didn't know yet if she wanted to do it for him, but she knew she was going to do it. And just as things were beginning to make sense, Edubiges finished observing and started to act. What she planned that night was cruel, calculated, and almost perfect. Almost. Edue Salazar wasn't impulsive. That's what made her dangerous. She never acted out of rage. She acted from calculation, from that cold part of the brain that keeps functioning when the rest of you wants to scream. And instead of screaming, asks, "What do I need to win this?" What she needed was simple in theory, complex in execution. She needed Fulgencio to stop seeing Consuelo, not as a woman. She hadn't reached that point yet, though Eduvige felt it was approaching, but as a person. She needed Fulgencio to look at Consuelo again, the way he looked at furniture, with functional indifference, without curiosity, without that new attention she'd seen in his eyes on Friday at breakfast, the attention that had kept her awake for 2 consecutive nights. She called Heriberto on Monday morning, not to ask him to do anything illegal. Edues was too smart for that. She asked for something subtler, access to the inventory records of the hacienda's domestic warehouse. "For what?" Heriberto asked. "For an internal audit of household expenses." "Fulgencio asked me to do it." A clean lie delivered with the tone of official business. Heriberto sent the files that same afternoon. Edues reviewed them with the patience of a surgeon and found what she was looking for. Or rather, she found the space where she could construct what she needed. A minor discrepancy in the February purchasing records. A 400 peso difference between what the receipt said and what the expense ledger stated. A data entry error. The kind of thing that happens in any household and no one notices because no one cares about 400 pesos when the hacienda moves millions. Eduviges cared. She took the error, amplified it, and painstakingly and precisely redocumented it in a new file that showed a 3-month pattern. inflated purchases, accumulated discrepancies, a total of 4,800 pesos diverted from the domestic account. It wasn't much money, it didn't need to be. It just needed to be enough for Fulgencio, who confused the price of things with their value, as Consuelo herself had told him, to see a number and stop seeing a person. On Wednesday morning, Eduviges waited for Consuelo to finish cleaning the main corridor. She arrived with the documents in a beige folder, without drama, without direct accusation, with the voice of someone resolving an administrative misunderstanding. "Consuelo, I need to talk to you about something regarding the inventory." Consuelo leaned the mop against the wall. "Tell me, are there some discrepancies in the purchase records from the last 3 months?" She handed her the folder. "Purchases from the market, the hardware store, the pharmacy, the amounts don't match the receipts." Consuelo took the folder, looked through it slowly, without rushing, with that calm that Eduviges found impossible to decipher. "This doesn't correspond," Consuelo said finally. "I have the original receipts. I can show them to you. I've already seen them." Eduviges pointed to a column in the document. "The difference is here. That difference is a data entry error from February. I noticed it in my first week and wrote it down in the kitchen notebook." "It's not new. The notebook says what you wrote in it." Silence. The two women looked at each other. Consuelo understood in that second exactly what was happening. Not with fear, but with the cold clarity of someone who has seen traps before. Not of this magnitude, not with this money, but the mechanics were the same. "Does Fulgencio know about this?" Consuelo asked. "Fulgencio asked me to review it." Another clean lie delivered with the same official tone. "Then, talk to him about it," Consuelo said, handing the folder back. Eduviges took it. "I will," she said, smiling. "I just wanted to give you the chance to explain yourself first." The chance, of course, wasn't a chance, it was the announcement of what was coming. Eduviges went to see Fulgencio that same afternoon, this time without the folder, without documents, with nothing in her hands. Just her and her voice, and 32 years of knowing exactly how to talk to this man. "I have to tell you something I didn't want to," she said, sitting down opposite him. "Because I know it's going to bother you." Fulgencio looked up from his papers. Eduviges spoke for 8 minutes, presenting the numbers, explaining the pattern, saying with the exact dose of regret in her voice that she wished she were wrong, that perhaps there was an explanation, that Consuelo surely had a different version, but the numbers were the numbers. Fulgencio listened without interruption. When Eduviges finished, he stared at the surface of the desk, his fingers still, his jaw slightly clenched. "Do you have the documents?" "Yes." "Send them to Heriberto for an independent review." "I already have." Pause. "Good." Eduviges waited. Fulgencio said nothing more. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What's appropriate?" What was appropriate was this. The next day, Thursday, Fulgencio called Consuelo to his office at 10 a.m. She arrived with her apron still on, because she was halfway through cleaning the kitchen, not knowing what awaited her. Or perhaps she did know. It's a part of you that feels the temperature changes in a house before anything happens. Fulgencio was standing, not sitting. That was already a sign. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He placed the folder on the desk. No preamble. Heriberto reviewed the records. "There are discrepancies in domestic purchases over the last 3 months. 400 and 800 pesos. Consuelo looked at the folder, then at him. "That's not correct. The numbers say so. The numbers were constructed to say so." Fulgencio frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means someone took a data entry error from February, which I documented myself, and turned it into a 3-month pattern that doesn't exist." She looked him directly in the eye. "I have the original receipts, all of them, from the first day. They are in my room. I can bring them now." Fulgencio hesitated. A second. Just one. And in that second, Consuelo saw something that chilled her breath. The doubt wasn't about whether she was telling the truth, it was about whether he wanted to hear it. Because Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel, at that moment, was doing exactly what she had diagnosed 2 weeks earlier. Confusing the price, 4,800 pesos, a small number, a ridiculous sum, with the value. And the value of believing Eduviges, of maintaining the order he knew, of not having to see what he was beginning to see, was infinitely more comfortable than the value of listening to Consuelo. "It's not necessary," Fulgencio said. Consuelo felt the impact of those 3 words, like a failing engine, not with noise, but with an absence of noise. with the silence where something should be. "Are you firing me?" she asked, her voice exactly the same as always, without a tremor, without a plea. "I am asking you to leave the hacienda before Friday." Consuelo nodded, stood up, walked toward the door, and there, with her hand on the frame, she stopped. Not to beg, not to defend herself again, just to say one last thing, with the same voice with which she had said everything else, direct, unadorned, without anger. "You made the mistake you told me others always made," she said. "You heard what you wanted to hear." She left without waiting for a response. Don Abundio saw her cross the corridor with that same calm, straight face of hers, as if nothing had happened, and something in him knew. Before anyone told him anything, he opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Hey, did something happen?" he asked. "No," Consuelo said. "I'm leaving on Friday." Abundio stood with his mouth open, watching her walk away. "Ay, caray," he said very softly. "Ay, caray, caray, caray." That afternoon, Consuelo went to Don Tranquilino's room. The old man was waiting for her, as if he knew. He had made coffee himself, which meant he had gotten up to make it, something he almost never did, and 2 cups on the small table. Consuelo sat down, picked up her cup and said nothing for a moment. "I'm leaving on Friday," she finally said. Don Tranquilino nodded, sipped his coffee. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "I've always had somewhere to go." The old man looked at her. "Before you go," he said, "I need to show you something." He stood up slowly, went to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, the one that had been stuck and that Consuelo had unstuck in her first week without telling anyone, and pulled out a yellowish, thick manila envelope, closed with a rusty clip. He placed it on the table between them. "This has been in that drawer for 40 years, he said. "I thought I was going to die without it mattering." A pause. "But I think it matters now." Consuelo looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it yet. "What is it, Don Tranquilino?" He placed a hand on the envelope, old, stained, slightly trembling. "The proof that this company has 2 owners." He looked at her. "And that one of them was never your employer." The silence that followed weighed more than all the previous silences combined. Outside, the garden was still, the sun was beginning to set, and in some drawer of that same desk, without anyone knowing it yet, was something that was going to change everything Fulgencio Aguirre Montiel thought he knew about his company, his family, and the woman he had just kicked out of his house. "See," he said. "Just when everything seemed lost, the universe was arranging the pieces. But what comes now? What's inside that envelope? You can't imagine." The envelope weighed less than it should have. For what it contained, 40 years of buried truth, an injustice with a name and date and notarized signature. It should have crushed the table. It should have made noise by its very existence. But it was there, still, with its rusty clip and its yellowed paper, waiting like things wait, things that know they have plenty of time, because truth doesn't expire. Don Tranquilino opened it himself, carefully, with the respect one has for opening things that cost a lot. Inside were 3 documents. The first, a company formation contract, signed in Mexico City on March 14, 1984. 2 names at the header, 2 signatures at the bottom, 2 notarized seals. Limited Liability Company, Transportes Aguirre y Vargas. Founding partners Rodrigo Aguirre Montiel and Gregorio Vargas Reyes. 50% participation each. Consuelo read that name, and her coffee grew cold in her hand without her noticing. Gregorio Vargas Reyes, her father. The second document, an agreement for the assignment of rights dated October 1991, supposedly signed by Gregorio Vargas Reyes, ceding his 50% of the partnership to Rodrigo Aguirre for the amount of 120,000 pesos. A ridiculous sum even for 1991, when the company already had 12 trucks on the road and contracts with 3 states. Consuelo read it twice, then placed it on the table with deliberate slowness. "This signature isn't my father's," she stated. Don Tranquilino looked at her. "Are you sure?" "Completely," and she was. She had seen her father's signature on invoices, on workshop contracts, on the letters he sent to his sister in Oaxaca. Gregorio Vargas signed with a G that coiled upon itself like a spring, a signature impossible to forge well, unless you knew it by heart. This attempt was clumsy, hurried, by someone who had copied the general shape without understanding the gesture. "I knew it," said Don Tranquilino. "I knew it from the moment they showed it to me, but by then I had no say in anything. They had removed me from the council the year before with another equally false signature." Consuelo looked at him. "You too?" Me first. The old man picked up his coffee with both hands. Rodrigo was clever. He got rid of us one by one. First me, then your father. By the time the company was truly valuable, it was just him on paper. Why didn't you report it? I tried. A long pause. Back then, a corrupt notary was worth more than the truth of two men without wealthy surnames. And Rodrigo had lawyers, and I had the same suit for all occasions. He drank. Your father also didn't want to fight. He said he preferred to live in peace than to die in court. Consuelo thought of her father, how he never spoke of the past, how, when she asked him where he had acquired so much knowledge of logistics and cargo engines, he would simply say, "From working, my daughter. From working hard and listening more." He hadn't told her anything. He had protected her from a rage he himself had swallowed. The third document was what Don Tranquilino had kept as the centerpiece of it all. A handwritten letter from Rodrigo Aguirre, Fulgencio's father, addressed to the notary who processed the deed. 3 paragraphs, no beating around the bush, with the tranquility of a man who expects no consequences. Vargas's signature is necessary to complete the process. Given that he will not cooperate, proceed as we agreed. The payment will be the same as in the previous case. The previous case was Don Tranquilino. Consuelo read the letter once, folded it carefully, and put it back in the envelope. "Why are you showing me this now?" she asked. Don Tranquilino looked at her with those eyes that see more than they say. "Because now you have somewhere to take it." A pause. "And because your father built something great and died without anyone knowing. That isn't right. It shouldn't remain that way." Consuelo held the envelope in her hands. It weighed less than it should, and at the same time, it was the heaviest thing she had carried since the day she found her father in the workshop with the radio on. "Does Fulgencio know anything about this?" she asked. "Nothing." Rodrigo made sure the story he told his son was clean. The old man paused. "Fulgencio isn't bad, Consuelo. He's ignorant, which isn't the same, though it hurts just as much." Consuelo spent the entire Thursday without leaving her room, except for the minimum necessities around the house. She thought about her father, who had built something with his hands and had it stolen from him with a pen and a bought notary, who had died at 44 with not an extra cent, in a windowless workshop, leaving his 17-year-old daughter to fend for herself in the world. She thought about Don Tranquilino, who had spent 40 years sleeping in the smallest room of a hacienda that was partly his, reading books with a magnifying glass, because no one had bothered to take him to the ophthalmologist. She thought about Fulgencio, who had built his entire identity on a story that was a lie, not by his own choice, but because his father had ensured he would never know the truth. She didn't feel anger. She felt something more ordered than anger. Something that resembled the clarity one feels when they find where the resistance is in a system and know exactly which piece to move to let the current flow again. That night, she called a number she had saved for months, that of a labor lawyer in Mexico City who had advised several domestic workers in her old neighborhood. He wasn't a specialist in commercial law, but he knew who to call. She explained the situation in 20 minutes. She scanned the 3 documents with her phone and sent them by email. The lawyer responded the next morning, before 8. "This is a forgery of a signature, before a public notary, a federal crime. If the documents are authentic, and at first glance they appear to be, the assignment contract is null and void. Your father's participation was never legally assigned. That means his rights passed to his heirs upon his death. That's you." Consuelo read the message 3 times, then closed it, put away her phone, and finished preparing breakfast. Friday was her last day. Fulgencio didn't come down for breakfast, or he came down late when she had already cleared everything away. Consuelo didn't know if it was deliberate or if the universe had simply decided to spare them that moment. Edubiges was in the dining room with his coffee, his sunglasses on, even though they were inside, with that expression of victory disguised as normalcy that only someone looking for it would find. Consuelo served him coffee without a word. As she turned to leave, Edubiges said, "Hey, Consuelo, no hard feelings, okay?" It was just a business matter. Consuelo stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She let the silence fill the space. Then she turned. She looked at him slowly. "Do you know the difference between a fixed engine and a patched-up engine?" Edubiges blinked. "The patched-up one still sounds bad." Consuelo continued. "It just sounds less so until it blows." She left the dining room. Behind her, Edubiges remained with his cup halfway to his mouth, with something in his stomach that wasn't exactly discomfort, but it wasn't the calm of someone who has won either. Don Abundio waited for her at the gate with a mournful face. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, though he already knew. "Really?" He scratched the back of his neck. "It's just that with you here, even the food tasted different. And I don't say that about anyone, I swear." Consuelo felt something very close to tenderness. "Take care of Don Tranquilino," she told him. "Don't forget his 6 o'clock coffee." "As if I could forget anything in this house," Abundio murmured. "Here I find out everything before anyone else." Consuelo got into her truck. Before starting it, she looked at the hacienda for a moment. The stone walls, the arches, the dry fountain, and in the window of the north wing, the small figure of Don Tranquilino, standing, with one hand on the glass. She raised hers, he nodded. The clean truck started, without coughing, without hesitation, as it always did when she drove it, and she took the Federal Highway 57 in the opposite direction to how she had found it. The manila envelope was in the glove compartment, and Consuelo Vargas Reyes, daughter of Gregorio Vargas Reyes, legitimate heir to 50% of a company valued at 2.3 billion pesos, was heading to Mexico City to see a lawyer. Without hurry, without anger, just with the quiet certainty of someone who knows where the resistance is, and also knows how to remove it. Fulgencio still didn't know what he had done. He still didn't know who Consuelo really was. He still believed he had solved a problem. He hadn't solved anything. He had only made it bigger. The workshop was still there. Consuelo hadn't returned since the funeral 7 years ago. The key was still on her keychain. She had never taken it off. She didn't know why. She just knew she couldn't. And the lock gave way with the same click as always, as if time hadn't passed, as if at any moment she would hear the radio and the sound of tools on metal, and her father's voice saying, "Almost there, my daughter, almost there." There was none of that. There was silence. Dust settled on the workbenches, tools hanging in the same order Gregorio had left them. He was like that. Everything in its place, he said. A messy workshop meant a mechanic who didn't know what he had. The radio on the high shelf with its bent antenna that never worked well, but which her father never replaced because he said it made him fond of it. The 2019 calendar, still on the wall, opened to November. Consuelo entered slowly. She sat on the wooden bench by the hydraulic press, the same bench where she used to sit as a child to do her homework while her father worked, with her notebook on her knees and her ears filled with sounds that were her first education. The name of each tool, the diagnosis of each fault, the difference between an engine that is tired and an engine that is broken. She placed the manila envelope on the workbench. She looked at it for a moment, and for the first time since Don Tranquilino gave it to her, something in her loosened. Not all at once, slowly. Like untying a knot you've carried for so long that you no longer feel it as a weight, but as part of your body. "They stole from you," she said in a low voice, speaking to the room, to the dust, to the November calendar. "You built something great, and they stole it from you, and you never told me anything." Silence. Why didn't you tell me? A different silence. The kind that has an answer, even if no one utters it. Consuelo knew the answer. She had always known it without knowing it, because Gregorio Vargas was one of those who carry burdens alone. Of those who think that protecting someone means not passing them the weight. Of those who believe that if you don't say it out loud, the harm stays inside and contaminates no one else. The same mistake she made, that she continued to make. She opened the envelope, took out the 1984 contract, and spread it on the grease-stained workbench, on the same spot where her father had spread engine plans, cargo manifests, and parts invoices for 20 years. Transportes Aguirre y Vargas. Founding partners Rodrigo Aguirre Montiel and Gregorio Vargas Reyes. 50% participation each. The printed letters. Her father's signature. That G that coiled like a spring. The notary seal. The date. March 14th, 1984. 16 years before she was born. Before the workshop. Before the Guerrero neighborhood. Before the radio with the bent antenna. Gregorio Vargas had been a founding partner of a 2.3 billion peso company and had died alone in that workshop at 44, without anyone knowing. Consuelo folded the contract carefully, put it back in the envelope, and then she cried. Not the cry of someone suffering now, but the oldest and deepest cry that exists. The cry of someone who finally understands a story that can no longer be changed, and who, by crying, doesn't change it either, but it needs to come out, because otherwise, it destroys something inside. She cried for a while, unashamedly, without rushing. When she finished, she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at her father's tools hanging on the wall in their perfect order, and said in a normal voice, as if he could hear her, "I'm not going to let it stand." That night, the lawyer, Evaristo Mondragon, 48 years old, a specialist in corporate law who had spent 15 years in corporate litigation before deciding he preferred to win important cases rather than make easy money, summoned her to his office in the historic center. He had reviewed the documents with 2 colleagues. "They are authentic," he said. Without preamble, the 1984 incorporation contract has a verifiable notary record. The signature on the 1991 deed of assignment is a forgery. We have 3 graphologists who would confirm it in an expert opinion, and Mr. Rodrigo Aguirre's letter is the most valuable piece. It's a direct confession of instructing a notary fraud. Consuelo listened to everything without interrupting. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that the 1991 assignment is null, that the 50% that belonged to your father was never legally transferred, and that at the time of his death, that percentage passed to his sole direct heir. How long will it take? The complete process can be lengthy, but there is a fast track, a precautionary measure of suspension of corporate operations while the trial is ongoing. This means no major decision for Transportes Aguirre can be executed without your consent until the case is resolved. He paused. Basically, you have veto power over the very company that just fired you. Consuelo pondered for a moment. When would the injunction be ready? If we start today, 2 weeks. Start today. What Consuelo didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that 400 kilometers away on the El Benedito ranch, Don Tranquilino had made a decision of his own. On Saturday morning, the old man called Fulgencio to his room, something he never did. Fulgencio was slow to respond, surprised by the gesture itself. When he entered, he found Don Tranquilino seated at his desk, a folder on his lap. "Sit down, Fulgencio." Fulgencio sat on the edge of the bed, uncomfortable, not quite sure why. "I have something to tell you about your father," the old man said, "and about the company, and about the girl you fired this week." Fulgencio opened his mouth. "Don't speak yet," Don Tranquilino cut him off, with an authority that came not from volume, but from something older. "Listen, that thing you never learned to do well," and Fulgencio, for the first time in many years in front of another human being, obeyed. Don Tranquilino spoke for 40 minutes. He told him everything. Since 1984, the partnership, the trucks, the growth, Rodrigo's betrayal, his own brother, how he'd pushed them out one by one with forged signatures and bought lawyers, how Don Tranquilino had tried to report it and had been crushed. Gregorio Vargas had chosen silence and dignity over a lawsuit he wouldn't win. How Gregorio had died in a workshop in Colonia Guerrero, leaving behind a 17-year-old daughter. How that daughter had arrived at the ranch 40 days ago to fix her car on the side of a highway. Fulgencio listened to it all. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He remained seated on the edge of the bed with his hands clasped, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. And Don Tranquilino saw something he hadn't seen in years, a man crumbling inside without a sound. When the old man finished, the silence lasted a long time. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Fulgencio finally said. His voice was muffled, without its usual tone, because there was no reason before. Don Tranquilino looked at him. "Now there is." Fulgencio stood up, went to the window, and looked at the garden without seeing it. "I fired her," he said. "Yes, I believed what Edubiges told me. Yes." A long pause. "The deed of assignment," Fulgencio said. "Did you see it? I saw it the same year it happened, and I knew it wasn't Gregorio's signature, but I already told you what happened when I tried to do something." Fulgencio turned. On his face was something that Consuelo would have recognized if she had been there. The exact moment when a man stops confusing the price of things with their value. The moment the system recalibrates, not smoothly, but with the jolt of someone who has just realized they've been looking in the wrong direction their entire life. "I need to find her," Don Tranquilino said. He almost smiled. "She's going to find you," he said. "Give her time." And he was right, because Consuelo Vargas Reyes wasn't going to arrive shouting. She was going to arrive with documents, with a lawyer, and with that calm of hers that was more powerful than any shout. What no one expected was how the extraordinary general meeting of Transportes Aguirre partners was called for the first Monday of October. Fulgencio had called it himself, something no one anticipated, because extraordinary general meetings were used for mergers, for crises, for decisions that couldn't wait for the ordinary calendar. The directors arrived that morning with faces that suggested they didn't know if they were going to a funeral or a fire, and they still hadn't been told which. The room was the same as always, the long oak table, the projector at the back, the freshly brewed coffee. 8 chairs for the directors, 2 additional chairs that no one had seen before, placed at the end of the table facing Fulgencio, for whom no one dared to ask. Edubiges arrived last, 10 minutes late, a deliberate delay, that way of hers, of entering when everyone is already seated, and the silence breaks to receive her. She sat next to Fulgencio with her usual smile, and placed a hand on his over the table. He removed it gently, without drama, with the same economy with which he did everything. Edubiges noticed. Something in her tensed invisibly. At 10:02, the door to the room opened. Consuelo entered first, not in an apron, not with a mop, but in dark clothing, her hair pulled back, the mechanic's ring on her finger. Behind her, Licenciado Evaristo Mondragon, with a thick folder under his arm, and the face of someone who has won litigation in more intimidating rooms than this one. No one spoke. Consuelo surveyed the table with her gaze. Heriberto, the accountant, the corporate lawyer, the 2 partners from Monterrey. And she reached Edubiges, who was looking at her with that trained calm, which this time had a very small crack somewhere behind her eyes. She sat in one of the additional chairs, Licenciado Mondragon in the other. Fulgencio cleared his throat. "This assembly has a single item on the agenda," he said. "The review of the corporate structure of Transportes Aguirre, based on historical documentation that has come to my attention." Absolute silence. The corporate lawyer, a 60-year-old man who had worked for the company for 22 years, frowned. "What documentation?" Fulgencio nodded towards Mondragon. The lawyer opened the folder and placed on the table, one by one, with a calmness that suggested he had rehearsed this moment. The 1984 incorporation contract, the 1991 deed of assignment, the graphological expert report from 3 certified experts confirming the forgery of Gregorio Vargas's signature, and Rodrigo Aguirre's letter to the notary, the letter in which he stated in plain terms what he had done and why. The corporate lawyer took it, read it, placed it on the table, and said nothing for the next 12 minutes. Edubiges was the first to react, not with a loud voice, but with that soft tone that was her first defense. "Fulgencio, this is old material taken out of context." "Edubiges," he looked at her. "Don't speak yet." It was exactly what Don Tranquilino had told him. The same tone, the same weight. Edubiges closed her mouth. Mondragon spoke for 20 minutes, explaining the nullity of the 1991 assignment, the hereditary transfer of 50%, the injunction already approved by the judge suspending any corporate modifications during the process, the criminal complaint for notarial fraud and forgery of private documents, a federal offense with a 15-year statute of limitations from discovery, filed that morning with the Attorney General's office. Heriberto, the logistics manager, who had signed the discrepancy report that Edubiges used to fire Consuelo, listened to it all with the face of someone beginning to do quick calculations about how involved he was in all of this. When Mondragon finished, the accountant was the first to speak. "What is the claim?" he asked in the neutral language of numbers. "Formal recognition of the 50% inherited shareholding," Mondragon said, "without economic retroactivity for the 34 years of undue deprivation, which would be the maximum claim. The young lady Vargas has decided not to pursue that path." All heads turned towards Consuelo. She sat with her hands on the table, her back straight, her usual expression. "Why?" asked one of the Monterrey partners, genuinely bewildered. "Because I didn't come to destroy," Consuelo said. "I came to make it clear what is mine and what was my father's." Silence. The kind of silence that carries moral weight, that makes some men lower their gaze and not quite know why. Edubiges waited until the directors left the room. Fulgencio asked for a 15-minute recess, and then spoke. He spoke quickly, he spoke intelligently, he told Fulgencio that it was all a maneuver, that the documents could be false, that there were lawyers willing to contest the graphological report, that she could obtain a counter-report in 3 days. She spoke of ongoing contracts that could be affected, of the company's public image, of everything he could lose if he let this continue. Fulgencio listened to her, and when she finished, he said only one thing. "Did you know the inventory documents were false when you showed them to me?" The silence that followed said it all. It wasn't the pause of someone who didn't understand the question. It was the pause of someone calculating if there was still an answer that would work. There wasn't. "Edubiges," Fulgencio said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has made a decision with no turning back. "I need you to leave here." What? The ranch. Today. Fulgencio, you can't. I can. He looked at her without anger, without drama, with that quiet determination of someone who finally knows where the resistance lies and has decided to remove it. Edubiges gathered her things, her hands, always so precise, so controlled, trembled slightly, just enough for Consuelo, who remained seated at the other end of the table, to see it. She felt no satisfaction. She felt something closer to the weariness of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and has just put it down. Don Abundio was at the gate when Edubiges came out with her 2 suitcases. He saw her pass, opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "May you have a good journey, madam," he said with all the diplomacy he could muster. Edubiges didn't respond. Abundio waited until the car drove away down the dirt road. Then he looked towards the house, then at the sky, then murmured, "For no one, and for everyone. I said it from the first day. From the first day I said it. No one listens to me, but I said it." The assembly resumed half an hour later. The corporate lawyer, the 60-year-old with 22 years at the company, placed his own document on the table. A quick legal analysis confirming what Mondragon had presented. No embellishments, no favoritism, just the analysis of a man who has learned that there are moments when the right side and the legal side are the same, and the smart thing to do is recognize it. The directors voted 4 in favor of immediate recognition, 2 abstentions, 1 against. The Monterey partner, who had the look of someone about to call his own lawyer as soon as he left, said, "Enough." Mondragon took notes. Fulgencio signed the minutes, and Consuelo Vargas Reyes, daughter of Gregorio Vargas Reyes, mechanic from Colonia Guerrero, a founding partner erased from history, officially became co-owner of 50% of Transportes Aguirre, a company valued at 2.3 billion pesos, with 400 trucks in operation, in 18 states, and a centennial ranch where the garden fountain was still not working because no one had bothered to fix it. Consuelo already knew how to do it, but what no one knew yet was what Fulgencio was going to do after everyone left that room, and what he was going to say, and how he was going to say it. That comes now. When everyone had left the room, only the 2 of them remained. Mondragon had gathered his folders with the discretion of someone who understands that there are moments when lawyers are superfluous. The directors had left in silence, each with their own calculations to make. Abundio, who somehow always appeared at the wrong moments, had poked his head through the door during the recess, and Fulgencio had looked at him in a way that made him disappear in 2 seconds. The room fell silent. Fulgencio stood by the window. Consuelo remained seated at the end of the table, her hands on the oak surface, waiting, not with impatience, but with that calm of hers, which was the first thing he had noticed on the side of the road, and which remained the most disconcerting thing about her, that ability to wait without pressing, like good mechanics who don't force parts, but let them yield on their own when they find the right angle. Fulgencio turned, looked at her, and Consuelo saw something she had never seen before, not in the garage, not in the dining room, not in any of the moments when the protocols between them had broken and been reassembled. She saw him without the architecture, without the company, without the surname, without the years of knowing that the world was ordered correctly, and he in the right place within that order. Just a 37-year-old man who had just realized he had built his identity on a stolen story and that the person he had treated like furniture was the rightful heir to half of everything he believed was his. "I don't know how to ask for your forgiveness for this," he said. Consuelo looked at him. "For which part?" she asked, not cruelly, like a genuine question. Fulgencio almost let out something akin to a bitter laugh. "For all of it, for how I treated you from day one, for listening to Edubiges without asking you for receipts, for not seeing what was right in front of me." Consuelo said nothing yet. "What my father did," he continued, and there was a weight in that sentence that Consuelo recognized. The weight of discovering that someone you love is capable of something you cannot justify. "What he did to your father, Adon Tranquilino." "My father is no longer here," Consuelo said. "And mine neither. What exists now is the 2 of us and a company built by 2 men, and it should remain the legacy of 2 families." Fulgencio looked at her for a long time. "That's what you want to continue." "I want it to work well." He looked at her directly. "And I know how to make it work well." "I know," he said. And he said it without irony, without the tone of before, with the simple recognition of a man who has been watching someone work and can no longer pretend not to have seen it. There was a silence, different from all the previous ones, lighter, the kind that fills space not because it's heavy, but because it breathes. There's a water pump that needs repair, Consuelo said, and a fountain in the garden that hasn't worked in years. Fulgencio blinked. That's the first thing you want to do. It's the first thing that needs to be done. He almost smiled. This time, yes, completely, though small. The kind of smile that appears when one doesn't plan it. Good, said Don Tranquilino. He was on his stone bench when Consuelo went out to the garden that afternoon. The old man saw her coming from a distance. He didn't change his posture, didn't say anything, just waited with that patience of his. The patience of someone who has learned that important things arrive when they are meant to, not a minute before. Consuelo sat beside him. The sun was setting. The garden smelled of damp earth because Abundio had watered that morning with the determination of someone who has something to compensate for, even if he doesn't quite know what. How did it go? Asked Don Tranquilino. Well, the old man nodded. And Fulgencio? Consuelo thought for a moment. Learning, she said. Don Tranquilino smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that needs no audience. The smile of someone who sees confirmation of something they've long awaited and no longer feels the rush to celebrate, because satisfaction needs no noise. He took the magnifying glass from his vest pocket and placed it on the book without opening it yet. Your dad would have been happy, he said. Consuelo didn't answer immediately. She looked at the dry fountain in the center of the garden, the moss-covered stones, the rusted spout, everything that had been broken for years and that someone had simply decided not to repair because it was easier to get used to the absence than to do the work of bringing the water back. I'm going to fix the fountain, she said. Don Tranquilino opened the book. I know, he said. 3 weeks later, the fountain was working. It wasn't quick or glamorous. The pump had to be replaced, the pipes cleaned, the moss treated with products Consuelo ordered from the hardware store in Colonia Guerrero, because the local ones weren't good enough. And convincing Abundio that the work of sanding the stone was necessary. And no, it couldn't be done in a day, no matter how much enthusiasm he put into it. The day the water flowed through the fountain again, Abundio came out to the garden, saw it and said aloud, not addressing anyone in particular, well, it worked, you just had to know how. Don Tranquilino, from his bench, looked up from his book. Consuelo, standing by the fountain, with her hands still damp, looked at him. Fulgencio, who had come out without being called, was in the corridor, leaning against a column, observing. No one said anything important, but everyone was there. That was enough. The changes in the company came later, ordered without haste. Consuelo didn't arrive with plans for revolution. She arrived with what she had always had, the ability to see where the resistance lay and know which piece to move to let the current flow. The first was the Monterrey warehouse, which had had the systematic overload problem she had diagnosed in 12 minutes at that board meeting. New controls, manifests verified at origin, an automatic weighing system that Heriberto, with the humility of someone who knows they owe someone something, implemented in 2 weeks. The second was a fund without fanfare, without a press release, without ceremony. The Gregorio Vargas Fund. Scholarships for the children of mechanics and transport workers. 20 annual scholarships, technical or university education. Renewable if the average was maintained. Fulgencio signed the deed of constitution of the fund, without her having to ask him twice. He signed it with the same economy as always, without a speech, without a gesture, but when he lifted the pen from the paper, he paused, looking at the name for a moment. Gregorio Vargas, what was he like? He asked. Consuelo, she said. He looked at her, silent. He said he knew how to listen to engines. Fulgencio nodded. He would have gotten along well with Don Tranquilino. They knew each other. Fulgencio looked at her. Did you know? I suspected it, now I know. Another silence, but no longer the heavy kind, the kind that has its own temperature and fits between two people without inconveniencing either. What happened between Consuelo and Fulgencio wasn't fast. It wasn't the kind of story that ends with a dramatic kiss in the rain and a declaration of love with background music. It was more like how she fixed things, slowly, piece by piece, finding the resistance, letting the current return on its own when the path was clear. Fulgencio learned to eat breakfast without his phone. Consuelo learned to let someone ask her how she was without always responding, fine. One Tuesday in November, the same month her father had died, though she didn't say it aloud, Fulgencio arrived at the workshop in Colonia Guerrero. She had gone to open it for the first time in weeks, to continue cleaning what remained of the dust. He arrived without announcing himself. He entered, looked at the tools on the wall, the November calendar, The radio with the bent antenna. He said nothing for a while. Then he took a wrench from the hook, held it, and returned it to the exact place from which he had taken it. "You were right about this," he said. "Everything in its place." Consuelo looked at him from the wooden bench. "Who?" "Your father, Don Tranquilino. He told me how he was." Consuelo didn't answer, but something in her settled. That piece that had been loose for a long time, that there was no way to put in place from the inside, that needed someone to arrive from the outside with the correct angle. Fulgencio sat on the bench beside her. He said nothing important. It wasn't necessary. Don Tranquilino died on a quiet Thursday in February, in his room in the north wing with the book on the bedside table and the half-finished cup of coffee. The doctor said it had happened during his sleep. Abundio, who found him at 6:30, when he went to bring him his coffee, and heard no response. He went out to the patio and said nothing for the first time in his life. He just sat on the stone bench and stared at the fountain. The water continued to flow at the small funeral, in the Querétaro cemetery, with cold earth, and a sky that couldn't decide whether to cloud over. Fulgencio didn't speak. Consuelo didn't either. Afterward, back at the hacienda, Fulgencio found a note on the old man's desk. Trembling handwriting, pencil, 2 lines. "What is built with the hands is not forgotten, only covered. You have uncovered it. It is well now." Fulgencio folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. He still has it. 3 months later, Abundio discovered that Consuelo had silently arranged for him to get a new hearing aid. He had lost part of his hearing years ago, which was why he spoke so loudly, though he had never told anyone. He found out when he went to the doctor for another matter, and the nurse mentioned that it had already been paid for. When he returned to the hacienda, he went straight to the office where Consuelo was reviewing manifests with Heriberto. He waited for Heriberto to leave, entered, closed the door, and said in a voice slightly lower than usual, which was his way of saying something important. "Listen, I knew from the first day you arrived that this would end well. I said so." Consuelo looked at him. "I know, Abundio. I do." Abundio nodded 3 times in a row, very seriously, as if confirming something for himself. "Well," he said, "I just wanted it on record." He left with his dignity intact. The last scene wasn't grand. It was a March afternoon with the garden at its best of the year, and the fountain sounding in the background, as it always should have sounded. Consuelo was in the corridor reviewing some contracts when Fulgencio arrived and sat down opposite her, without announcement or pretext. He looked at her. She looked up. What did he say? "Nothing," he said. And that was true. It wasn't anything urgent. It wasn't a problem to solve. It wasn't a decision to make. It was just him, sitting across from her in the corridor of a hacienda that now belonged to both of them, with the water running in the fountain and the afternoon sun splitting everything into light and shadow. As always, as it should have always been. Consuelo returned to her contracts. Fulgencio stayed there, doing nothing in particular, and for the first time in many years, that seemed enough. Sometimes things are not lost, they are just covered. And there are people who know they always knew how to uncover everything.